What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of 10X Recruiting brought to you by MetaView. Today, we talk to Chris Adams on the show, and Chris is one of the world's best sourcers. He joined Uber as their first sourcer before going over to Atomic as a talent partner. Then he started his own very successful recruiting business where he had an amazing exit. So again, today is all things sourcing, and here are my top 2 takeaways. The first is that calibration is critical. Now, there are many ways that you can calibrate with the hiring manager, but the best way is synchronous, literally sitting with the hiring manager, opening up your LinkedIn, walking through your Boolean string, and the results will ultimately get you the best candidates aligned with that hiring manager in the fastest way possible. The second takeaway is the key metric to assess the health of your hiring process is the onsite to offer ratio. Ideally, 3-to-1 is very healthy. Anything above 4-to-1, it's getting a little bit broken and you need to look into what's going on. So without further ado, here is my episode with Chris Adams. I hope you enjoy it. This is 10X Recruiting, a podcast from MetaView. Let's get after it. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of 10X Recruiting. Today we have Chris Adams. Chris, what's up, man?
How you doing?
I'm
Happy
doing good.
Whatever day it is today.
Today is it's early February of 2025. The world is changing very quickly. Let me set the scene for the audience a little bit here. So you and I were like children together, like way back in the day at Google. You then joined Uber as the first sourcer and helped build out the sourcing practice at Uber. You went on to Atomic, which is kind of like one of these famous like early stage venture places as a talent partner. And then you started a company called TalentHerder, which you ended up selling and was acquired. You've seen a lot of stuff, man. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's been a fun, 12 to 13 years or so. I call myself an OG, I guess. And it's funny talking to recruiters like you and other folks in talent, essentially, that have been around for, I guess, 10 years plus, at least. And, everyone has different backgrounds, coming in with different styles and approaches. Obviously I built my kind of like recruiting career based upon sourcing. And I feel like that's an area that I feel is undervalued, has been undervalued in different markets. It really depends on kind of what year it is, what's going on holistically, economically, and just understanding how sourcing plays a role in the overarching like hiring funnel, whether it be referrals, whether it be inbound, whether it be sourcing. I think like sourcing is super important. So
I also think sourcing is super important. And yet I feel like it's kind of like the ugly redheaded stepsister of the recruiting function. But today my goal is to actually like showcase what world-class sourcing looks like. So we're going to get like deep into the nitty-gritty of tactics and strategies that you use. So let's get into this thing. So let's start at like the very beginning, right? Say you're like working with a brand new hiring manager and you've never worked with this person before. And my experience has always been that new hiring manager is like, I want a unicorn with rainbow feathers that farts fairy dust. Go find them on LinkedIn for me, please. How do you calibrate that person? Like, what does that process look like to actually get to reality? Because there's a lot of different phases here with like, if you're like at a Series A company and nobody knows who the hell you are, like you're not going to recruit engineers from OpenAI. So how do you calibrate that person on the profile, specifically about what's right for them and their company?
This is funny. This is, I think this is a recruiting 101 question in general when you start interviewing internally at companies too, right? And people have different answers. I think for me, the one thing that I think people miss is like looking at the historical data. So, albeit it might be an early stage company, I think like, either the founder, whoever the hiring manager may be, has kind of a profile in mind and you're trying to extrapolate that from them. And to do so, I think it's actually really tough, right? You can't just do it over a 30-minute sync, in my opinion, to where you're talking about the skill sets. You're talking, hey, I like, folks that come from a top school. Well, what does that mean? And does it have to be CS, right? But maybe a candidate doesn't come from a top school, but they're at an Airbnb for the last 4 years and have previous co-founding experience. So I think there's like concessions you can make within sourcing, but really to uncover that, I think you have to understand the historical data. And what I mean by that is like looking at, is there anyone existing on the team that you'd like to replicate? That's kind of like the first question I ask, right? But that could be a biased viewpoint as well, coming from a founder who's hired their best friend. And it's like, this is my best employee. But from a sourcing perspective, you can't really replicate that on paper as well, right? So for me, it's like calibration, I think, is the most important factor in terms of getting started. A lot of recruiters or sourcers come into an engagement and they go right off the bat and start sourcing on LinkedIn, reaching out to hundreds and hundreds of candidates. Those candidates start to respond positively. Then you try to interview them and put them through the process. And, you wasted not only 2 weeks of work, but you also wasted a bad, that creates a bad candidate experience, right? You're reaching out to candidates, they're responding with interest. And the founder's like, I don't like any of these people. Then what do you do with that bucket of 30 candidates that have responded with interest, right? So you kind of put yourself in a bad position. So for me, I actually like to keep it very rudimentary and build out a calibration batch. It's like, you go through the intricacies of the role, talk about the skill sets, build a quick calibration of 20 candidates, go into a sync with that founder and really dial in on each profile and indicate why they're not a fit or why they are a fit. And you can kind of build a good, profile on your own from there, I would say. And so actually, funny enough, when I initially, we can go into this a little bit further, but when I built TalentHerder, I actually went in trying to build a Tinder for recruiting app. That was kind of like what I wanted to do, right? When I was at Uber, for example, I remember, a tool came out called, God, I forgot the name. Was it Beamery? Might have been Beamery. Anyways, what it was basically you just scrape a bunch of profiles and you had to have the emails in the right. It was basically when email outreach started to become a thing. This was like on, at the probably mid-career at Uber. We started to get these email automation tools because up until that point, right, this was maybe 2015, 2016-ish. It was all LinkedIn Recruiter Outbound. There was no gem, there was no top funnel, there were no tools that really allowed you to have a separate funnel approach into sourcing. So when these tools came into fruition, I basically thought, okay, well, that's interesting, right? But you kind of have the back end covered of like the outreach methodology. But what about who the sender is, right? Like, I think that's important, right? People were getting blasted by recruiter and sourcer outreach from Uber. We were trying to hire 60 Eng 2s at the time, right? So it's like, what do you do? Just blast everyone on LinkedIn and hope and pray with no automation. Then we were doing manual follow-up. So literally all of the sourcers at Uber and recruiters, we would literally do our initial outreach message. Then we would have to go back and do the follow-ups over LinkedIn, which is basically just another day's work just to do the follow-up messaging campaigns. And so like what I always thought in the back of my head at Uber was be interesting if like right now I'm sending, I was working with 12 different hiring managers at the time. I would send them a calibration set of like 20 candidates each. They would thumbs up, thumbs down, add notes. I was like, it'd be interesting if there was a tool that could combine not only the kind of like Beamery, Gem, top funnels of the world from an outreach perspective, but also combine like a calibration layer on top of it. And it was like an all-in-one tool. And so I actually built that after, this is post-Atomic when I was thinking about starting TalentHerder. I went and hired an Upwork developer to build me just a quasi, one-click functionality over LinkedIn. And it would put it's basically a candidate database in a nice baseball card format UI, where you could essentially just like hiring manager could go in, thumbs up, thumbs down. The goal there was eventually to build a mailing platform on the back end to where like hiring manager can make a selection and it would send automatic emails from their own Gmail API. And they would wake up Monday morning and their inbox is filled with interested candidates after they've been swiping all day over the weekend. So I built that as kind of like, what I wanted to eventually build from when I started TalentHerder. And then the market just picked up and it became a services business. What I wanted to do was build a, really what it was a Tinder for recruiting web app. Initially wanted to build a company based upon a tech-enabled services. The tech piece kind of slowly started to dwindle as we got more clients, as the market started to pick up, and as we found kind of product market fit as a sourcing as a service agency, if you will. And so we kind of rode that wave, right? Our model worked really well for early stage companies that just needed to hire 2 to 3 folks consistently month over month, but it also worked really well for, the Grammarly firm size clients that really needed to push on hiring and had multiple headcount that just wanted a plug and play approach to sourcing.
Let's go back to 12 hiring managers at Uber, right? Everybody wants, the second coming of the person who works 90 hours a week and is an Olympic gymnast rather. How do you calibrate them? So you said you have this like doc, right? So you're like putting in LinkedIn links, and then there's a notes section, and then you're always going to get that one hiring manager who like basically greenlights 2 of those people. What is the next step in that process to calibrate?
Yeah, and I think that is something that you'll continually run into. And that's a hard one, right? Because like you could do hundreds and hundreds of calibration, but they're only choosing 5 candidates. There has to be some concessions to be made, right? Because as a recruiter, as a sourcer, you just can't do your job, right? If you're looking for a needle in a haystack. Now, granted, I think Uber is a bad example, just given the fact that like if you threw a stone at someone who is at a top tier company, like Uber would probably wanted to have interviewed them at the time, just given the fact that we were hiring at such a high cliff. But taking it back to kind of like, picky hiring manager, if you will, quote unquote, because that's what you're talking about.
Or unrealistic, right? Maybe said differently, like unrealistic hiring manager.
Yeah, unrealistic is a better term, I think. At that point, so calibration should do the job, right? In most cases, I'd say 95 to 98%, like you can do a quick calibration and figure out what the right archetype is. And I think if you even do it might take 2 to 3 iterations of that calibration where you're reviewing candidates in real time with the hiring manager and asking the questions of why not. That should get you to the goal.
I like the idea of doing it synchronously, by the way. Like, I think the synchronous idea is like, because I think a lot of people end up sending the doc, reading the feedback, and then being like, oh shit, like this, like they're completely off base. When like, actually, if you sit next to them, you have the opportunity to get their real-time thinking and then also calibrate that real-time thinking so it's not off into never land, and you can bring them back closer to reality.
I 100%. I mean, real-time calibration, just for all you sourcers and recruiters out there, if you're sending a doc and you're getting that doc back in real time, and then you feel comfortable, or not in real time, and you're getting that back and you feel good enough to go and start a search, I would double click on that just as an FYI, because I do think that the real time sync on your work from a calibration perspective, like you can ask follow-up questions, you can really just reading their nonverbal communication as to how they're reading a profile in general will help you a ton. So I agree with that sentiment. Going back to kind of like, what is the next step if there's just calibration's not working, generally speaking, you guys can't figure out what the archetype is, you literally screen share, do your LinkedIn search, and look at the results and figure out and go and literally, that's what I do. That's what I like. I will go and sit with a hiring manager, a founder, whoever the case may be, senior recruiter, head of talent, right? Go through a search with them and literally like put in my keywords, put in all the things that they're asking for as well, and look at the results and show them the data, right? Like, and I go back to my first point of like, look at the historical data, understand like who's in the company or like who's someone that you want to replicate. If there's no one, that's fine. But then if you can't come to a conclusion on calibration and the hiring manager still doesn't have an archetype in mind, I would literally sit there and screen share with them. All right, I'm going to put in all my LinkedIn filters. Here's what I'm doing. Here are the results. Now there's 17 people in this particular region with this particular skill set that we're trying to go after. Do you think that's enough pipeline for us to make the hire? Probably not. So then like, let's figure out what we can take out, what we can leave in, and come up with an archetype. At that point, if they're not amenable, then you better fire that person. I'm just kidding.
the historical data piece is interesting too, because I think what ends up happening as top performers emerge inside of a company is everybody forgets where that top performer started. And it's often not the, gold star resume. It's often like the chip on the shoulder person that like we can't really define like what it actually was in their LinkedIn, but it wasn't like Airbnb, Google, Uber sort of a background. Maybe it was like a lot scrappier. And so I actually love that as a way to help hiring managers reset expectations and then to like bring them again closer to reality and anchor them in somebody that they're like, they love this person. They want this person replicated 10x over in the company. That's a really smart tactic that I think can get people there a lot faster. Okay, let's go to the next thing. So say we're calibrating and we feel like we've gotten the hiring manager to reality. The next step is now the outreach, or you're going to start going to outbound these candidates. What are your secrets there?
I can't share that, Nolan. I'm just kidding. I can. I'm here to share this information. So there's so many ways to cook a chicken, right? And you'll be surprised how many approaches have been taken. Some work, some don't. You could reach out to everyone on LinkedIn and I'm sure you'll get a hire, right? The problem is you're going to have a lot of battles along the way and post battles after and I'm talking about from an aftermath perspective. But I've seen, there's your typical volume based sourcers, and then there's and then there's like this quote unquote like sniper sourcers. It's all in the old kind of dilemma of like, do I need more volume or do I need more personalization to get better response rates at the end of the day? Like those are the two battles in everyone's mind. Like how do you marry the two? I don't think there's a perfect marry situation there. I think it's like you just have to be smart around the metrics and you have to be really smart around how you're engaging candidates using the right messaging. Now, granted, if you're hiring for senior full stack engineers, right, with no other stipulation other than the fact that they need to work on a front end technology, like the world is your oyster, in that sense, right? So I think there's different types of searches. There's ones that are like, this person has to have a machine learning emphasis from a fine tuning perspective, but also come from a healthcare background or something, right? Like where it's just not as feasible. There's going to be a very small pool. So therefore, like, what tactic do you use in that scenario when it's a very difficult and very like fine, a search that will take a lot of like actually due diligence and research versus a search where it's like, there's 3,000 results in San Francisco, for example, right? I just think there's different approaches in how you engage candidates from those different types of buckets, right? So let's just take bucket number one, the unicorn, purple squirrel, the machine learning expert, maybe coming from a healthcare background, or a senior staff engineer that doesn't, that can be okay with a remedial base salary, but wants to take a ton of upside from an equity perspective. I think like you have to get creative in both cases, right? The more volume, high volume roles, and then also the purple squirrel. So in any case, what I'd like to do is actually have two funnels of approaches. Like one is recruiter reach out, one is founder or hiring manager reach out. So you gear yourself up accordingly. So whenever I started a new company, I always like to at least request, hey, founder, hiring manager, is there a chance I can get like an email alias on your behalf? Because I'd like to reach out to the top 1 to 3% of candidates using your alias. Everyone else that we don't have enough data on or might have a bare bones profile that we really can't tell what they're doing, but worth a reach out, I will use a recruiter reach out. So you have two funnels of engagement essentially, right? So as you're sourcing, if you find the perfect person on paper, you can do a hiring manager outreach. If you find, a good candidate on paper, but there's still questions, you do a recruiter reach out. I think in that case, you kind of cover your basis and the response rate will be greater potentially coming from, a founder or someone in a leadership role from the company that you're working with in general. I think if you're using good, concise messaging, and I think messaging is everything, right? You could reach out to 1,000 people, you could reach out to 10 people. If you have a message that's not going to capture someone's attention, I think you're doing yourself a disservice, obviously. Um, and I like to A/B test initially as well. Like I don't like to get out of the gates reaching out to hundreds and hundreds of candidates. Small subsets, see what the response rate is, and then once you feel comfortable enough in your pitch and your outreach messaging and your cadence, then you can start to explore the volume side. So the first couple of weeks are really just exploration, right? Understanding what the profile is, how you're going to engage, what your messaging structure will look like. Give yourself time on that, because at the end of the day, you might be wasting a reach out, a crappy reach out on a really good candidate. Whereas like you could have reached out to that candidate with a great message that is going to work and get that person's attention.
Okay. So like what I want to just quickly recap for the audience there, which I think is really interesting, is the notion that, you have two paths here. One is that you're sending the message. The other is that it's coming from a hiring manager alias. But the caveat being on the hiring manager alias, you only have a couple of bullets to spend there, and you need to spend them wisely. Otherwise, you erode trust with the hiring manager. So say the hiring manager, and we'll talk about messaging. I'm going to click into that in a second. But say the message comes from the hiring manager, the candidate responds. You're not doing the bait and switch there to where like then you end up talking to the candidate, right? Like the expectation is the hiring manager is talking to the candidate as part of the first screen.
That's correct. Yeah, and that's the goal, right? I mean, you kick off with the hiring manager. Your first question is like, what's your bandwidth like? Are you able to take, 5 to 10 informal 30-minute conversations weekly in addition to my own recruiting work? And I think that like kind of sets the tone for like a hiring manager and recruiter sourcer relationship essentially too, right? Is understanding what each person's bandwidth is. And if, and that actually, funny enough, will give you a good indication if hiring managers are motivated to recruit. Now, granted, I know people are busy, but I'm sure hiring managers and founders alike could maybe carve out like an hour and a half of their time, which is really, if you separate that by 30 minutes, is, 3 potential really good conversations that they could be having with great candidates at the forefront. So,
yeah. Yep. I agree. So, okay. So like, let's go back to, let's click into messaging more. And here's what I found. I want your feedback on like how I've been doing messaging recently and what I'm finding that's working for me, and just like pattern matching over what's worked and what hasn't worked. So what typically has worked for me is I call it the trust bridge. So I'm trying to create a bridge of trust between me and the candidate with something that makes them feel safe. So 2 examples I have is when we were doing this at DoorDash. I was in 2015. We were in Palo Alto. If you didn't live in Palo Alto, you had no fucking idea what DoorDash was. And the way I established the trust bridge with candidates on cold outreach is I said, Sequoia led our seed and Series A, and Alfred Lin is on the board. That helped establish a trust bridge with the candidate because Sequoia is one of the best investors in the world. Alfred Lin specifically is like, he's on the Midas list. And if you know anything about venture capital, you know Sequoia and Alfred. The thing I'm doing now with one of the clients that I'm currently helping is I'm actually using my own background. So it was like, hey, I was like the head of talent at DoorDash, the chief people officer at Carta. I started a company. Now I'm working with this client because I think they're a winner. And so I'm trying to like establish that bridge with them to make them feel like 15 minutes on a call with me is not going to be a waste of their time. What's your feedback on that approach?
This is one of the times I might disagree with you in a sense.
Good.
Here. Yes, I agree with you, right? If you have a company with really no brand, right? Like let's say you're pre-seed let's say you're pre-seed, seed, just getting off the ground, no branding, you have a website, a couple million in funding, whatever that looks like. Like, yes, I think to your point, DoorDash, no one knew about DoorDash in 2015 unless you lived in Palo Alto. I get that. A lot of times I think when there's that established presence that this is a real company, I think actually folks might get turned off a little bit by that are looking for more early stage and more scrappiness, in my opinion. And case in point, like, if I reach out from a founder directly and I have a 1-page Notion doc that explains the engineering challenges, the team culture of 4 people out at the Presidio having tea, or like, playing ultimate frisbee, right? Like something like that might be more enticing than just saying, hey, we're Sequoia led, like we have a ton of money in the bank, like you're going to make an impact here, versus like, hey, this is a company that's just getting established, yeah, we have a little bit of funding, but we're not, we're not a DoorDash 2015, right? But that we aim to be. And this is why I think you should join. Literally, I think like you could use, and this is what I stress to most hiring managers and founders, is like, if you don't have a brand, like create your branding in just a one pager. I think that in itself, with short, concise messaging, that one pager is your trust, right? Like that
That's so good.
That should be your, that should be your kind of like, recruiting pamphlet, if you will. And I think, I've gotten so many candidates to respond with interest for pre-seed and seed by using a one pager, short and concise message from the founder. They have some material to read off of, not just some text saying, hey, we're founded by XYZ, because that's every other recruiting message, right? So what's going to differentiate your messaging? And I think it comes down to some of the media content within that, right? I even think like, some of these companies are building like, 1 minute video. I think that's great too, right? Like having the founder chat. Case in point, real fast, I had a bad experience with that though. There was a founder that I worked with early on in my agency career, or post Uber, but when I first started TalentHerder, he was a CTO. He filmed a 30-second video of himself talking about the engineering challenges with his leg up in a cast on the desk. Typical kind of, yeah.
So we could get feedback on it, right? But so now you're getting my wheels turning. Okay, so how many messages are you sending in a sequence to a typical candidate?
Yep. So my messaging cadence is such to where I like to do first message, relatively long, maybe 2 paragraphs max, maybe 1 paragraph, and then like parenthetically you have the Notion doc somewhere within there, right? So,
cool. Yeah.
And I think, and then every other message is kind of a push to connect. I've seen Kanye West memes. I've seen crazy things that actually work. You never know if someone's having a day or not. They might be wanting to leave their job that day, and you catch them on that second or third iteration of messaging. I think just generally speaking, you have to continually nurture the pipeline, especially if you're aggressively hiring, until that candidate says, go kick rocks.
Never email me again. Yeah. Okay.
Something like that, right?
So you're saying like, it could be as long as like 7 messages in a sequence?
I usually do 5, split over time. So, usually 3 messaging, 3 pings within about a week and a half's time frame, no more than 2 weeks. You want to get at least like 3 messages out. And then maybe what I've done is like typically sequence it out every 2 to 3 weeks as well. 1 additional message, usually up to about 5. The problem is that you don't even know sometimes if that's the correct email handle too.
Exactly.
Right? Even if it doesn't bounce, maybe they haven't checked their EDU email since they were in college, right? So, I use tools that you can essentially allocate different emails. But I will tell you, I say the number one, that's a great way to build volume, to continually have a nurture campaign going, right? But I think like I said, there's 2 funnels. There's recruiter outreach funnel, which should be about 70 to 80% of your outreach, like Chris Adams, Nolan doing outreach messaging as a recruiter using our brand to capture someone's attention. The other ones are the best candidates that you've come across. You bucket into the hiring manager outreach. You let those campaigns go for a while, right? I think as a follow-up, like, oh shit, I haven't made the hire yet tactic, and this is one that's worked for me every single time as kind of like a fallback for me, but takes a lot of actual time up front. Connection request from the founder's LinkedIn with a short note to connect.
Yeah.
No one ever thinks about that, right? But even if you log into your, like, let's say you're a recruiter, right? You log into your LinkedIn recruiter account, you have your personal LinkedIn, then you could choose to go into LinkedIn recruiter account. When you go into your messaging, you could see the sponsored messages, you could see your actual personal messages that are being sent to you, right? The personal messages people pay way more attention to, especially if even if they're not actively looking, they still click through that information of those unread messages. And so when someone requests a connection request, sends a request for connection, you also see that note, right? And then you connect with them directly, and then that message pops up as the first message in your inbox that's unread within LinkedIn. It kind of lives there in your face when you log into LinkedIn versus the in-mail messages are kind of like separated to an extent. So this has worked really well, is like you send a connection request from the founder directly to a candidate that you might have been trying to get through previous email outreach. Essentially, hey, I sent you a couple messages. Sorry to bombard you, but would love a chance to connect with you. Here's my scheduling link. Let me know. You
Okay.
get the connection request, and then you get a potential request to conversation going there.
Yeah, that's good. That makes intrinsic sense. The other one that I think people skip over is the warm intro. So, it turns out the world is a much smaller place than we think. And, especially if you're working with like a connected founder, or if like one of the investors, that's involved with the company is really connected, they can often intro you to people who you want to talk to. So have you seen any good strategies of like how to operationalize and make the warm intro part of the way that you do sourcing?
And you're referring to essentially like leveraging a founder's network to be able to get more
Whether it
intros,
be a
correct?
founder, whether it be a hiring man, right? So say I'm sourcing and I notice that you are connected to somebody who might be interesting for my search. What I would do is I would first ping you and I would say, hey, Chris, how well do you know Jane? And if you say, I don't know Jane at all, then obviously like it's not worth the time. If you say, oh, me and Jane are homies, then what I would do is I would say, Chris, can I send you a forwardable note? Which, by the way, nobody does this well. Like I actually did this terribly when I first started Continuum, and I got feedback from an investor and it changed my life. And I will put the link of the doc that the person sent me in the show notes.
Okay.
But basically it's like the subject line is like intro to Jane. And first line is hey Chris, thanks so much for forwarding the below note to Jane. And then it goes Jane right into the message of like why I want to talk to you. And I have found the likelihood of success that Jane is going to engage with me when I do that strategy is like 5x more effective than cold.
I agree with you in terms of the engagement factor, just because they're getting a conversation and I think in some cases people feel forced if they're pinged in a non-discreet way in that
Exactly.
sense, right? So then they're
Yeah.
having a conversation, but they're like in the back of their mind, they're thinking, no matter if you could sell me the bee's knees and you're going to offer me 250K, I know I'm staying at OpenAI, right? Like they just know that, and they're kind of like forced into this conversation. So actually, I think all of the time, if there's a way that you could scale this, yes, great. But realistically, if you have to grow your engineering, product design, EPD team to 30 plus, like that's not a feasible way to. Now, granted, it's a nice way that you could get a quick win from that, and you could really get top talent. So I think there's two factors there, actually. If you're hiring at such a high clip, I don't think you'll have the bandwidth, nor like you can't scale that to reach a certain headcount, a certain OKR from your headcount to fill these particular roles. If you can build a company out of that. I know there's companies out there that were trying to build like, hey, let's peruse through your referrals and like let's find ways to engage them. But like to your point, I forgot where I was going with this, but like,
Well,
yes,
that's the volume. That's the volume versus precision discussion, right? Like, I agree with you. If
real
you're
fast,
looking,
Nolan.
yeah, go ahead.
My point was this. So so just as an FYI, like from a recruiter's lens perspective, that works really well if you're looking for really top known entity type talent that is the purple unicorn that like Jane is going to fit the job because our bar is so high as an organization. But let's say you're building an Uber for dog food company that just got off the ground, no product market fit really, just a couple of founders in a garage building something. Is it going to really does it take that type of approach? Or would you rather just go and ping a bunch of people to see if they're interested? I think just because realistically, like it's going to be hard to sell someone into a particular type of company. So if you're taking the time to go out and like find a new unique way to find this like basically be a sharpshooter and like use this approach, I just think it'll deter from all the work that you could be doing to ping people. software engineer, parenthetically, and dog lover, that should be your search. You could probably get like a lot of ROI from just that search in itself.
Good point. I think you're right. And I think that's maybe like talking about roles, like when you're talking about just kind of like general full stack engineer or exec
Yeah.
recruiting,
Yeah.
right? I think exec recruiting is going to require a much more handheld process to get the people who you really want on the phone, because there's just fewer amounts.
Yeah, and my experience is not in like I've hired for exec roles and founding engineers, founding talent, but like when you're dealing with CMOs and CTOs of Series C and D, it's a different type of ball game, in my opinion, in terms of the way that you engage. So that approach right there, I think, is case in point, like a great exec search, purple squirrel like way that you can get a really high ROI and clip. But then again, like to my point, right? Um, a lot of times I think people might feel forced into those conversations and it might not necessarily be an ROI. Maybe you A/B test it, right? It's like, hey, I have 5 intros using this methodology. Did any of them work out in terms of next steps?
Yep. Got it. Okay. Let's talk about just the sourcer role in general. So what I'm currently seeing is, call it early to mid-sized companies are not hiring sourcers. They are hiring full stack recruiters with the expectation that that person also is sourcing. When should a company start to think about like hiring, say, like a first sourcer or like building out a sourcing team?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, trust me. I think about this all the time, and like sourcing has changed from 2022 to 2025. The lens on recruiting in general is changing, and the landscape in general. But the way that folks, I think, look at sourcers and what their ROI looks like, I think, is changing. Right. The old days of like going out and hiring a sourcer at a really high base salary for them to do 200 outreach a week with a 15% positive response rate, I think is like over. I don't think you need that type of person. And to your point, like a full cycle recruiter, um, it's hit or miss. Do they want to do sourcing, right? Like a lot of recruiters, especially like relatively like junior ones, didn't grow up essentially sourcing. They grew up into moving into a recruiter role where they're handling a lot of process, handling the back of the funnel, building out ATS, helping out with ATS implementation and making sure that like the company is on the right trajectory. I think generally speaking, like you could talk to probably every recruiter in just say Bay Area right now, and it's like, hey, if we had a solution for you that like you could just have all of the top of funnel in your inbox, interested candidates every day, do you need a sourcer? No, right? So like I think that's where we're headed. I think sourcers are becoming, I don't want to say extinct, but I think their skill set is becoming valued in different ways where yes, you could do sourcing, but like we also want you to close these candidates for this pipeline, right? So you have to be able to flex your muscles as a sourcer this day and age. If you're because people are hiring sourcers all the time right now. I still see it, but to your point, I think a lot of like mid-size or just closed an A round type companies are looking at it and saying like, well, we have these agencies we can rely on. We're hiring, internal sourcers. They could spend 70 to 60% of their time sourcing, the rest of the time doing your recruiting work. I just think that like, so recruiters don't want to source, right? At the end of the day, I think it's becoming more prevalent that like recruiters are starting to become, uh, valued at other parts of their job in terms of like, and they want to focus on the candidate side versus the kind of heads down, sitting in a cafe, reaching out to 500 candidates.
Yeah, but just because they want it doesn't mean so my take is on the other side for companies is that the expectation is the recruiter has to do everything. And that's been especially true as like recruiting budgets have been hammered because there's just fewer people to do all of the different required activities. So that's kind of what I've been seeing. And I feel like where the puck is going is sourcers aren't going extinct for late stage companies. But I think for early and mid stage companies, when there is a big push, those companies are much more likely to rely on outside sourcing to help build more of the pipeline required, because it's just the math doesn't math Like you need numbers at the end of the day, and hiring a sourcer for multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, I don't think makes a lot of sense in today's economy.
I agree. I do think that the way like recruiting is in a weird inflection point right now with AI being incorporated. With ChatGPT and Claude, and I use these tools on a regular basis for like messaging and things like that. But I can envision a world in which you put in a query and it just spits back like it prompts you with the best candidates for your particular role. Now, granted, like how you engage them and all of that, like that's still going to be the recruiter's responsibility. But I think 2022 prime example, like recruiters still had to do all that work. Like ChatGPT never existed, so it was essentially like we had to come up with our own messaging cadence and kind of A/B test it on our own. Whereas now you have intent-based agentic AI as well that's coming into fruition, where I think it's going to be interesting to see how that technology incorporates into the recruiter ecosystem, to where it's like, all right, this messaging is going to work because of this intent factor. And I think that go to market right now is already at the forefront of this. I think recruiting is one level behind that in terms of where we're at in the race, right? Like, there's companies out there like Landbase, for example, is one of them that I came across that's like agentic AI, and they're basically, and companies like Nooks, and, there's just like super interesting companies that are kind of not replacing your, quote unquote salesperson, but like, assisting them to where you don't need a fully fledged SDR doing clicking buttons, sending outreach. It's more so they are navigating through the funnel and prompting AI with the right messaging and cadence to be able to see the ROI, right? Like I think it's just generally speaking, like you will start to see that come into fruition for recruiting. I don't know who's working on that. Bless their soul.
That's where the puck is going. Totally. Yeah. Totally. Okay. Talk to me about like sourcer metrics. So, and I think break it down between sourcers and recruiters, but specifically with regards to sourcing, what should the expectation be for reach outs per week and response rates? Like what does good look like?
So it's funny, when we were at Uber, we built out a OKR of 2.5 technical phone screens per week was the OKR for a sourcer at Uber. And what that meant was like you had to schedule 2.5 hiring manager screens, technical phone screens weekly. We got into a really tricky situation because people just wanted to hit their OKR. There wasn't a quality metric there. So people were reaching out to, companies that they knew might not be a good fit for Uber, and, just to get the metrics in line. And so that's where we had to get in front of it and essentially put like, tag the hiring manager first before you schedule that technical phone screen. But from a metrics perspective, I don't care if you take the sniper approach. I don't care if you take the volume approach. I just need the end result of what that OKR weekly looks like. And for me, I look at it as a 3-to-1 ratio always. And what I mean by that is if you have 3 candidates in pipeline, one person should move forward in any case. So and what I mean by that is like, if I have let's just call it 5 hiring manager screens weekly, that gives me 20 overall hiring manager screens in a month. If you're not getting an offer accept from those metrics, something is wrong, either in process, either in the candidates that you're sourcing, what have you. I always look at it like if you have 3 to 5 positive responses weekly that convert to the next step in the process, that should get you roughly, 3 on-sites monthly. Break that down, 3 on-sites should equate to at least 1 offer extend, 1 offer accept. As a sourcer, maybe back in the day, your OKR was based upon offer extends. I think it still should be the case, but now people look at the end result as an offer accept as a valid OKR. However, I think if you're hitting the 3 to 5 positive responses weekly, that should convert to your back of funnel metric of like on-sites to offer extend ratio, in my opinion.
Yep. That makes sense to me. And then when you're reporting metrics to leadership, what are you including in that roll-up?
So yeah, I'd say what leaders want to see is end result as well, right? But they also want, if metrics aren't being met, then they want to see what's going on in the process. It's always the case, right? So generally speaking, I try to paint the holistic view. Total outreach numbers, outreach metrics, total response rates, positive response rates, how those positive response rates, I think the biggest factor is recruiter phone screen to hiring manager screen and whether those move forward or not. That's like the biggest metric you can index on, because then that equates to the quality metric from the recruiter or sourcer side, if you will, right? Are my recruiter screens being converted into positive technical phone screens that get moved to the next step in the process? And I think that is like the number one metric that you need to index on as an organization to understand, like, if a recruiter or sourcer are actually like are not wasting their time, like, are they actually putting their time into quality sourcing and quality screens? Because if those screens aren't being converted, then there's no point in actually reaching out to those people. So at the end of the day, you have to look at that metric. And I think that metric is probably the most important in my eyes. And I try to relay that to leadership as, hey, if my screens are converting into positive technical phone screens that are moving through the process, whether a candidate gets to on-site or offer is not my responsibility, right, as a sourcer, because my job is to provide great candidates at the top of the funnel that convert from the hiring manager's perspective.
Yep. The thing you said in there that I think resonates deeply with me is that you actually have to explain the metrics and the metrics that really matter, because it's really easy to just like send over the Google sheet and say like, here's all the shit I did. But if you're not actually walking through specifically like the hiring manager, sorry, the technical phone screen to on-site stage being important and why that's important, you can't expect leadership to understand it, because typically nobody does. It's the same at every single company, every single time they go through this for the first time. Everyone's just trying to dial it in. And the only way they can actually dial it in is if you are their Sherpa and you're showing them what matters and explaining why.
Great point. Yep.
So, Chris, this was a blast, man. Thanks so much for joining us today.
So much fun. I appreciate it, Nolan. Thanks for having me on.